It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle. This is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. And you can always catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays. But you know what? Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. This week's feature is a little different than most of what I've covered previously and plan to cover going forward. Monster Monday celebrates the idea of a wolfman or a vampire or a giant lizard or monkey monster rampaging through a city and what have you. Maybe the monsters are mythical creatures or creatures that exist in nature that we didn't know were there. Maybe the monsters came from outer space. Well, this time I want to talk about a quote-unquote monster movie in which you never actually see the monster stalking our unaware victims. 1999's The Blair Witch Project. There are a few reasons why I wanted to talk about this movie and why I feel like it can fit in with the idea of Monster Mondays. First and foremost, there is a monster at play in this movie, the fictional Blair Witch. It's maybe more of an entity or a force within a wooded area of Maryland, but it is monstrous in nature and has monstrous intentions. I've talked about mythological beasts when I discussed Clash of the Titans. Here we're dealing with folklore. We've all heard stories before. Every neighborhood and every kid has one about something they heard or conjured up themselves about a killer or a witch or a madman who lives out there in the woods and kills trespassers and so forth. These days, folklore now extends to urban legends and the so-called creepypasta that is best described as creepy internet stories that are meant to be shared and passed around like urban legends or folklore told around a campfire and so forth. A lot of horror is built around folklore, to be perfectly honest. Folklore is basically intended to be more, folksy in nature. What I mean by that is that it started outside of cities among the mostly poor and uneducated people who lived in rural areas. In some ways, it was a way for them to share funny anecdotes, tell tall tales, tell morality stories through fairy tales, share ghost stories to frighten people into doing right, and even sharing poetry or song lyrics. Much like mythology, it could help those in more isolated areas or smaller populations come to grips or understanding with something and basically shape their worldview. Conspiracy theories are mostly born out of folklore as well. Again, it's a way to explain something that fits or shapes the worldview of a certain group of people. I could go into much deeper detail in how folklore even shapes social or political ideals, by doing nothing more than pointing to a map that shows who voted for what. You'll typically see cities and urban centers vote a different way than those who are in between those areas. But I think you get the point here. So here in America, we often like making up these scary stories. I'd say that while vampires and werewolves and even possibly alien encounters can go back hundreds, if not thousands of years in some instances, I'd almost argue that our most favorite monster to fall back on in a scary story is a witch. Sure, Europe had fairy tales that often would feature a witch, but it's hard to argue exactly how deeply connected the witch is to American folklore. So here we are, the Blair Witch Project. There really isn't too much of a plot to talk about here per se. It's basically about three college documentarian filmmakers who decide to create a documentary about the fabled Blair Witch of Maryland. So they go to the tiny town of Burkittsville, Maryland, a real place I might add, and hear tales about a guy by the name of Rustin Parr who was a hermit and killed 7 or 8 kids he kidnapped in the 1940s. He supposedly committed the crimes because a witch told him to. This connects to the same tales from the 1700s about Ellie Kedward, a woman who was accused and found guilty of luring children into the woods and killing them. She would be sentenced to die of exposure in the woods, ultimately becoming the Blair Witch and haunting those same surrounding woods around Burkittsville. So these college kids, Heather, Mike, and Josh, go into the woods, find areas detailed in various writings about the area, the Blair Witch, and Parr. As time passes, strange things begin to occur. Some of them begin to act irrationally, leading to their map being lost or tempers flaring and so forth. Each night, noises are heard around their tent. Little piles of rocks are found outside and surrounding their tents, and stick figures representing the Blair Witch herself begin to appear. At first, they kind of think that this is just somebody messing with them, but soon Josh ultimately goes missing, and Heather and Mike frantically try to find him while becoming ever more lost in the woods. They eventually find an abandoned home with lots of symbols and children's bloody handprints before ultimately succumbing to a mysterious fate and disappearing themselves. This movie has as many detractors as it does fans. Most critics did rather enjoy the movie, and it sits at an 87% on Rotten Tomatoes with over 150 logged reviews of it. I do find it funny, though, that the Razzies, those ever vigilant purveyors of jokes and odd comedic snobbery, nominated it for Worst Picture of 1999. I'd argue that this is a movie that does kind of have a shelf life. I'd argue that most people who didn't see the movie 20 years ago might unfairly claim that it should receive the derision because it put the subgenre of the found footage horror movie into overdrive, or fans of it would compare it to the more jump scary found footage movies that come out now and say it's a little slow and boring. More on that. But first, let's talk about the subgenre of found footage. For those of you who may not know what that style is, it's basically a movie that is intended to be shot in a first-person style. It's often framed either as a fake documentary like the Blair Witch Project, or home movies documenting a specific event or creepy goings-on in their lives like the Paranormal Activity movies. Often the intent is to basically place the audience into the shoes of the actors and give them a first-person experience to that horror. When done well, it can be particularly creepy, outright scary, or possibly even unsettling. When done cynically as a cheap cash grab for studios to basically make money while spending as little as possible, it can be utter shit. A lot of people will say that the Blair Witch Project is the first found footage film, but that is not true by a long shot. It may be the first to become a successful mainstream release, but it is not the first film of the subgenre itself. That honor goes to 1980's Cannibal Holocaust. Now, that's a movie that I'd love to talk about either on this show or on Film Seizure with Jason, or even write about it on B-Movie Enema, because it is important for several reasons. But really, as it pertains to the Blair Witch Project, Cannibal Holocaust was shot as a documentary with a narrative opening and ending framing the found footage element. I won't go into too much detail, but like with the Blair Witch Project, the actors in Cannibal Holocaust were basically, in one way or another, sequestered to keep up with the realism of the movie itself. Exactly how much the actors in the Blair Witch Project were totally kept out of the limelight or sequestered as opposed to just being unknown actors at the time is probably not on the same level as Cannibal Holocaust, and it's probably a little bit more organic for the people in the Blair Witch Project. But being unknowns at the time certainly helped with the ultimate marketing and reaction upon release. Again, we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Cannibal Holocaust is an underground cult classic to this day, but less than a year before the Blair Witch Project came out, another found footage film, The Last Broadcast, was released. The Last Broadcast was also an extremely small budget movie that did exceptionally well. It's doubtful the makers of the Blair Witch Project knew anything of The Last Broadcast and vice versa, considering the Blair Witch Project was filmed in 1997 and just not distributed until 1999. The Last Broadcast does have the distinction of being likely the first movie to ever be entirely shot and edited on consumer-grade digital equipment. So let's put this to bed. The Blair Witch Project did not start the found footage craze that is still continuing today. However, its popularity and box office performance, you can absolutely draw that line to it, and led to studios and indie filmmakers going back to that very frugal way to get a movie made and garner a reaction and word of mouth. The movie itself did not set out to create the subgenre. It was just the popularity. It was all of us that created that subgenre. So let's be more fair to the Blair Witch Project than some people are. All right, so let's get to my 3 things that I like about the Blair Witch Project. To start, while it does not have the same effect today as it did then, I love the marketing of this movie. Nowadays, it is more of a study of how the right ideas and enough people with the ability to further those ideas can really generate a juggernaut of pop culture awareness of a movie. It's super easy for studio tentpole movies like Star Wars or a Marvel movie or Jurassic Park to flood stores and television commercial breaks with imagery and promotion. But what do you do with a movie that costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $60,000? Well, you have unknown actors playing parts in this movie that aren't really doing a whole lot else in other things, generate the idea that these are actual students making a documentary that ended up missing under suspicious circumstances that might be supernatural in nature. I mean, shit, even IMDb listed the actors as missing when you would look them up back in 1999. It's an incredible look at viral marketing before there was even a thing that was viral marketing. I don't mean this in a smug way, but the masses are pretty easily manipulated by marketing. It's why marketing is a thing, after all. Make people believe this was a real disappearance and hold that ruse for as long as you possibly can, and people will show up to watch this movie in droves. It was brilliant. And I admit, I really believe this was a real thing that happened to these people for a little while leading up to the wide release of this movie. I don't quite remember if I already knew it wasn't real when I saw it in August of 1999. But today, I marvel at the marketing of this movie and how perfect it played out. And I can't help but to think of all of that when I watch it even 20 years later. Next, I utterly love the pacing of this movie. It's about as much of a slow burn horror movie as you can get. That's one of the reasons why some didn't like it back then, and it's not likely going to hold the attention of younger people coming to it now as opposed to seeing it when it was new. This movie really only has chills. It uses ambient noise, sounds from the distance, and never actually showing you the entity chasing these people and creating their fear. It's all done off camera. It builds this creepy sense of desperation as each segment of the movie passes. And again, the first-person nature of found footage puts you there in the woods with them, and you can feel the proverbial walls closing in on you. I know the tone, the pacing, and the characters' plights had me feeling tightness in my chest, and my girlfriend and I were clutching each other tightly from about halfway through until about 4 days after we saw that movie. And that brings me to my third like. When I saw this movie the first time, I was in Boston with my then girlfriend visiting some of her family. We saw this was playing in Harvard Square, so we went and checked it out. It was the first time, as a side note here, it was the first time I had ever been to a movie theater that had auditoriums with balconies. Growing up in Indiana and growing up mostly in multiplexes, you don't see too many balcony movie theaters much anymore. The place was packed, and it was just one of those wonderful communal movie-going experiences. That's not to mention that being in Boston during that week, we found ourselves driving through none other than Salem, Massachusetts. So let's think about that. I'm seeing a new movie about a witch while in the general area of the most infamous witch trials the world has ever seen. Then I go see this movie with my girlfriend, and later that night we go to another of the small towns that cluster around Boston and visit a friend of hers after she got off work that night. We're sitting in this parking lot in a car in deep darkness while I'm looking out the window to a wooded area that was near where this girl worked. I don't think I've ever felt more uncomfortable fear in my life. It was one of the best nights of my life also, I'm not going to lie. It was just one of those, after seeing that movie, after being there in this area that's known to be supposedly super haunted here in the United States, it was a great night. I was scared shitless, but it was a great night. I realized that 2 of my 3 likes also don't have that much to do with the movie itself, but stuff that surrounded the movie. And allow me to explain my reasoning behind choosing those as likes. This is a movie that came out at an important crossroads in my life. I was 22, and the thought of needing to be an adult was all around me. I'm not in school anymore. I'm needing to provide for myself more and more for various reasons. And while it did take a little time to fully realize that adulthood for me, the people I was with at the time, the things I did during that time, brought about a great period for me personally. This came out during a time and a lot of personal and cultural significance, and I think about that whenever I watch this movie. I know what happens. I know where most of the scares are, but I can't help to be brought back to that summer of 1999. And it generally makes me happy watching it and thinking about this movie and everything that surrounded it. Lastly, I want to bring up that poor town of Burkittsville, Maryland. So, like I said, that is a real place. And I mentioned that earlier in this episode. But it is a town of less than 200 people. But the popularity of this movie brought about an unexpected flood of fans visiting and wanting to take pictures and meet people and talk to them about this movie and so forth. Their town sign, which was seen in the movie, was often stolen until they had to actually redesign it to make it something that no longer matched the look of the film, and therefore kind of turned off the fans from trying to steal it because it was no longer the thing that you saw in the movie. So these poor people had to deal with a lot of fanboy bullshit over the years. But to be honest, you can never tell when something lights the world on fire, I guess. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later. And don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure each and every Wednesday and new installments of Monster Mondays on filmseizure.com. And also check out new posts at my website, bmovieanima.com, each and every Friday morning.
Bye.